Welcome to the Venda, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Kara Megan Lewis, and I am the Deputy Director here at the museum. Welcome. For those of you who might be visiting for your first time, you might be wondering why we are outside in the heat of an August in Southern California. And this is because our A-frame theater, which is forthcoming, it's just mere moments away from being complete, is still not occupiable. So just thank you so much for your understanding. We have lots of water. The water is flowing, and hopefully you can each find a piece of shade. And I'm here to introduce, of course, today's program to the success of our hopeless cause, Benjamin Nathan's On the Soviet Dissident Movement. I first want to express gratitude to all of those who make this program possible. First, the funders who give financial support to our programming, Rick Feldman and Susan Horowitz. Thank you, Rick and Susan. And also because this is a program that is so closely linked to our collection, and will be bringing life to the objects and artifacts in our collection, I just want to thank our donors who help us continue to grow that collection, Arcadia Fund, Coombe Foundation, and David Thompson. I also want to acknowledge our staff who makes all of our events possible. Rachel Rigdon, our events and programs manager, who's on the colonnade, making sure that you're all under shade. Maggie Jonas is our lead of engagement, who is leading the team to make sure that everything is in place and that everybody is comfortable. And just our entire visitor engagement team, who makes it all seem so easy. I did want to give you a little bit of context about the museum if this is your first time visiting. The Venda is an art museum, cultural center, and archive that preserves history and brings it to life through exhibitions and programs. Furthermore, we are a place that prioritizes and values change and transformation. You may know that Venda, or Die Wende, refers to the time period around the fall of the Berlin Wall, just before and after. In German, Wende means transformation or change. And this weekend's programs have been exemplary of this ethos of change or transformation. Yesterday, we had Susan Burton on stage, who is the founder of A New Way of Life and a leader in the criminal justice reform movement. She shared her journey of transformation and the ways in which she is contributing to the metamorphosis of women who are coming out of incarceration. And just this morning, we marked the graduation of our Watts Initiative High School Professional Development Associates, who have spent the last 3 months here with us learning job skills training and going through their own personal and professional transformation. And in just a few minutes, historic moments of transformation will be brought to life through the scholarship of our guest today, Benjamin Nathan's, whose extraordinary new book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, tells the story of descent in the former Soviet Union from Stalin's death to the collapse of communism. Objects and artifacts produced and distributed by Soviet dissidents, or as the book refers to them as other thinkers, permeates the museum's collection, from our ever-growing collection of samizdat materials, underground publications of the Soviet Jewish Refuseniks, Soviet hippie notebooks, to the shivs made by contemporary Russian dissident Nadia Tolokhanova. We are dedicated to preserving the platforms through which dissidents shed light on the hope of freedom. And it is so exciting to think that in just a few moments, these objects are going to be brought further to life through Benjamin's scholarship and words. A bit more about Ben Nathan's before I welcome him to the stage. Among the 5 books that Ben has written, Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia was awarded the Koret Jewish Book Award, the Vucinich Book Award, and the Lincoln Book Prize, and was a finalist for National Jewish Book Award in History. Ben is also a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement. Ben is the Alan Charles Kors Associate Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, modern European Jewish history, and the history of human rights. Today, we have the honor to be his students. Please join me in welcoming Ben Nathan's to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? In the back? In the mezzanine? Sidewall seats? It's great to be here. It's an honor to have been invited by the Wende Museum to speak to you. And I want to thank the whole staff, Kara and others, for making this visit possible. I know it's hot, but trust me, where I come from, namely Philadelphia, it's not only this hot, but it's 97% humidity. So this is downright civilized. And I'm very happy to be with you here today to talk a little bit about the work that I've done and what I've learned from that work about the history of dissent in the Soviet Union. The game plan is for me to talk for about 40 minutes and then leave another 20 or so for Q&A. And I do very much welcome your questions and comments after my remarks. So the Wende Museum, as you probably know, takes its name from this extraordinary moment. It lasted about 2 years, but it felt like a moment, something very fast, between 1989 and 1991. And I'm going to guess that some of you in the audience have enough miles on your odometer to remember that period in history when things seemed to change overnight in the most dramatic way possible. And the Wende is the German word meaning transformation or turn or hinge moment to describe what happened particularly in Germany during those years, or I should say in the two Germanys, East and West Germany. It just so happens that in November of 1989, I found myself in Berlin on the way to the Soviet Union to do research, not for this book, but for another one. And I was there just a few weeks after the wall came down. It was one of the most dramatic and euphoric moments that I've ever experienced. And since I was then in the process of being trained as an historian, I really had this feeling in my gut that I had walked into an historical laboratory, that this enormous experiment was going on, a kind of tectonic shift, where one system of power and of governance, but also way of living, namely socialism, Soviet-style socialism, was disintegrating in front of my eyes to be replaced by no one really knew what. For me, this was one of the great stimuli to my thinking about change in history and specifically change in the eastern half of Europe and the Soviet Union. And it was easy then, and I think it's still easy now, to think that that's the way totalitarianism ended. Like a collapsing souffle, something that you just had this sense, if you were being there, that history itself was speeding up, that the pace of time was accelerating. Or as historians sometimes like to put it, more work was getting done in that moment, that window of 1989 to 1991, than normally gets done in decades, maybe even centuries. It's that sense of the acceleration of time that I think was so intense for me and everybody else who lived through it. Of course, me as an outsider, as an observer, but especially so for the people of the former Soviet bloc. The work that I did on the dissident movement in the Soviet Union persuaded me that that perception was wrong. And that totalitarianism in the Soviet Union itself, which was the epicenter of the socialist world, did not come to an end suddenly, like a house of cards coming down in 1991. You may remember the August coup of 1991, when Gorbachev was placed under house arrest in the Crimea, and when a group of people that he appointed essentially to his government took over and threatened to turn the Soviet Union back towards its Communist Party dictatorship. You may recall when Gorbachev resigned in December of 1991. I watched that on TV in Leningrad at a friend's apartment. It all seemed to have this drama of the moment. What studying the dissidents in the Soviet Union persuaded me of, though, was that the seeds of totalitarianism's end had been planted 40 years earlier. And that what is really interesting about the end of totalitarianism is not this image of a house of cards collapsing, but rather of the drama of a society, the Soviet Union, attempting to find an off-ramp from totalitarianism. And that off-ramp actually begins in the 1950s, and specifically in March 1953, with the death of Joseph Stalin. In my mind, Soviet history is divided into two starkly contrasting halves. The revolutionary, militant, savage, fatal for so many millions first half of Soviet history, from 1917, the revolution, to Stalin's death in 1953, and then the second half, from 1953 to 1991. Officially, the story of the second half is how to transition from a socialist to a communist society. And without getting into all the technicalities of that distinction, it basically means, how do you let the state wither away and have a society where everybody gives according to his or her need and ability, and everybody receives according to his or her need. That was the official story of what the second half of Soviet history was about. But I found a different story, and that story was the attempt to exit peacefully from totalitarianism. So many of the great studies of totalitarian rule, and if you start at the top, it's Hannah Arendt's magnificent book on the origins of totalitarianism. So many of them, understandably, are focused on the origins of totalitarianism. How do you go from a monarchy to a single-party totalitarian state? And I'll admit, as a member of the Guild of Historians, that one of our fetishes is origins. We're all about explaining how things come into being. But I'm actually interested in how things come to an end. And nobody really had a good theory about how totalitarian societies end. It seemed to be a kind of a simple answer. Oh, they end when they lose a catastrophic war. That's what happened to Nazi Germany. That's what happened to fascist Italy. The system is crushed by a superior external force, another army. But the Soviet Union was the one of the three great totalitarian states that emerged victorious from the Second World War. It was not crushed by an outside force, and therefore was not subjected to the same processes of denazification or defascification that post-war Germany and Italy were. And that makes the Soviet Union a really interesting historical laboratory, because it turns out that the Soviet regime itself, once it survived Stalinism, was trying to extricate itself from the violence, the internal violence of totalitarianism. So one way of thinking of Soviet-style systems is that they rest on three pillars. Dictatorship by a single party, the Communist Party in the case of the USSR, a centrally planned economy, also known as the command economy, where prices and wages and rents and everything is set by the state, and the use of mass political terror. These were the three pillars on which the Stalinist system was built. And the great experiment of the second half of Soviet history was, can you subtract that third element? Can you remove mass terror from the repertoire of governing practices and still have a viable system? Single-party rule, centralized planned economy. It was the removal of mass terror that made possible the phenomenon of dissent. I like to use a really narrow definition of terror and terrorism, whether it's state-sponsored or not. And for me, the logic of terrorism is its randomness. It makes everybody afraid because people are subject to it, whether they did something illegal or suspicious or wrong or not. That's why so many entirely innocent people, people loyal to the Soviet regime, people loyal to Stalin, were sent to the Gulag in the 1930s and 40s. It's the essence of terror that nobody is safe. And as ironic as it may sound, the most insecure place you could be as a member of Soviet society in the 1930s was a high-ranking member of the Communist Party. And even worse, a member of the security services, the predecessor of the KGB. the turnover in those arenas, high-ranking party members, members of the security police, was higher than in any other sector of society, because the level of suspicion and paranoia, not to mention the very human political rivalries and antagonisms, were at their most intense precisely in the party and the KGB. So a cynical person could say that the motive for removing mass state-sponsored terror from the Soviet system in the second half of Soviet history was all about survival. The leaders of the Communist Party recognized that they just couldn't go on operating according to Stalin's model, because sooner or later each of them would be sucked into the vortex of politically inspired terror. I think there was a higher motive as well. They wanted to realize the full potential of Marxism-Leninism, and they recognized that they couldn't do that in the system, or at least some aspects of the system that Stalin had built. So the second half of Soviet history, 1953 to 1991, is all about, can we have a socialist system without mass terror, without people living in fear in their own apartments? And it's that shift that made the dissident movement possible. And here's the story that I tried to uncover and make sense of in my own way. It all begins with a very eccentric mathematician who lived in Moscow, born in 1924, the illegitimate son of a marriage between arguably Russia's most famous poet at the time, Sergei Yesenin, a so-called village poet, and a translator, Nadezhda Volpina. And this son was named Alexander Volpin. He aspired at certain times in his youth to being a poet like his father, but he recognized that he didn't have that talent, and instead he became not just a mathematician, but a mathematical logician. He was interested in the nature of truth statements in mathematics. And like so many Russian and Soviet intellectuals, he couldn't be held down by disciplinary boundaries. He was interested in truth, capital T, across all disciplines. And his goal became to fashion an ideal language, a perfect language, in which there would be none of the ambiguity and confusion of normal human languages, like the one I'm speaking to you in today, English. With all of those dual meanings and ambiguities and subtleties, he wanted perfect clarity. Because, as he put it, we will only be able to trust our own thinking when we come up with a language that has scientific precision. He never found that language. It probably doesn't exist. But along the way, in his enormous sweep of the intellectual landscape, he discovered a second best option, a plan B. He began reading the Soviet Constitution, and he discovered that there were fantastic civil liberties enshrined in that Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and others. And he decided if only Soviet society could be made to live up to those civil liberties, then we could really put an end to the arbitrary application of violence by the state against its real or perceived enemies. As you can imagine, someone thinking like that in the 1940s while Stalin was still alive, sooner or later was going to get picked up by the security police, which in fact is what happened to Volpin. He was sent into exile in Karaganda in Central Asia, today Kazakhstan. He was placed temporarily in a psychiatric hospital because his ideas were read as symptomatic of what they called sluggish schizophrenia. In other words, he was subject to more or less all of the various punishments that the Stalinist system could deliver short of execution. And when he returned to Moscow, having been amnestied in the weeks after Stalin's death, in the spring of 1953, he decided that it was time to make his program real. And making that program real meant forcing the Soviet government to honor its own constitution. It seemed so simple. All the rules are already there. You just have to publicize them, publicize violations of them, particularly by the state, and sooner or later you will bring theory and practice into alignment with each other. And so he waited for a proper occasion to come along when he could put this idea of insisting on the rule of law into practice. And that occasion came in 1965, when a pair of writers, Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, who had been issuing works of fiction under pseudonyms, and when I say issuing, I mean hand typing them, reading them and giving them to friends who would copy them on their typewriters in the system known as samizdat, or what we would call self-publishing. The KGB finally caught up to them. I tell the details of that detective work in my book, and they were arrested and a trial was announced. And Alexander Volpin, this mathematician who looked to Soviet law as a kind of a perfect language for the pursuit of truth and justice, decided to organize a demonstration on their behalf. He decided to call this demonstration the Glasnost meeting, the transparency meeting. The idea being the way you make the Soviet government honor its own laws is to be transparent about their violations, to publicize, give oxygen to their violations in an attempt to expose injustice. And he decided to time the demonstration to coincide with Constitution Day, which was December 5th. This was the anniversary of the Constitution that had been ratified on December 5th, 1936, under Stalin. And this is the moment, the birth moment of the dissident movement. About 20 to 50 people showed up for the transparency meeting. They were immediately seized by the KGB, which had learned of the meeting in advance because it had moles everywhere. Only a handful were arrested. Most were released. When Volpin himself was taken to prison and interrogated, he simply said, all I was trying to do was to honor the Soviet Constitution. And that, in fact, is what his banner had said at the demonstration: respect the Constitution of the USSR. So for a lot of people, this was a very clever, typically sort of intelligentsia strategy. You use the state's language against itself. You apply the logic of the state and of civil liberties to the state's own behavior. One way of thinking about this strategy that the dissidents developed is as a campaign of civil obedience. I use that phrase, they didn't use it, I use it to contrast to our own traditions, which were so powerful during our own civil rights movement at roughly the same time, of civil disobedience. That's a tradition that, of course, goes back to Henry David Thoreau, Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, Rosa Parks. And you know what civil disobedience means. You deliberately violate certain rules in order to expose their injustice and attempt to get them overturned. Whether it's in the Jim Crow South or in New England in the 19th century, where taxes are being taken from citizens to finance American wars abroad. Civil disobedience is about breaking the law to expose the injustice of the law. The grand strategy of the Soviet dissidents was exactly the opposite. It was to be a strictly law-abiding movement in order to demonstrate what obedience to the law looks like, in the hopes that the state might also begin to act that way by obeying its own laws. So the Glasnost demonstration, the transparency meeting, happens in December of 1965. Various members are arrested. New protests break out about their arrest. The trial of Sinyavsky and Daniel occurs in February of '66. More demonstrations, more arrests, and importantly, some of the family members of the two defendants at that trial in February '66 managed to gain entrance to the courtroom, which is theoretically open to the public, but is actually stocked with KGB agents. Relatives managed to make their way in and create a secret transcript of the trial. Yuli Daniel's wife, Larisa Bogoraz, arguably an even greater dissident figure than he was a linguist by training, an excellent taker of notes in shorthand, and she was able to create a verbatim transcript of the 3-day trial, which was then circulated in samizdat. This story multiplies and gathers momentum like an avalanche. Protests, arrests, trials, secret transcripts, circulation of transcripts inside the Soviet Union and abroad, more protests, more arrests, and it forms a kind of chain reaction, a snowball. Nobody is controlling this. It's this spontaneous emergence of people under the new post-Stalin system where mass terror is no longer practiced. You can get arrested, but it's almost always going to be for something you've already actually done. But more and more people are attracted from simply an individual level of their own conscience telling them this is the right thing to do, to go to these protests, to sign public letters in defense of people who've been arrested for things that they insist are not actually crimes. How can the dissemination of information about a trial in a Soviet courtroom be a crime? Is that not covered by the free speech and free information articles of the Soviet Constitution? So the chain reaction goes on for several years following the first sort of trigger event, the Glasnost meeting, the transparency meeting of December 1965. People sometimes ask me, how many people were actually dissidents in the Soviet Union? And the answer is the number was vanishingly small as a proportion of the population. The maximum extent, if by dissident we have in mind anybody who at least once in their lives signed an open letter of petition against the arrest of so-and-so. The number is about 1,000. And that's in a population of close to 280 million. So it's a very, very small number who were actively engaged in what I'm calling the chain reaction, the protests, the demonstrations. But if we widen the circle a little bit to include people who didn't necessarily put their name to letters, which was risky, but who either produced or consumed or helped distribute samizdat texts. These were, every imaginable genre, hand-typed on onion skin paper, using carbon paper to create 8 or 10 copies at a time. You'd be pounding on your typewriter to create multiple copies in a kind of chain letter. One person who used to type samizdat told me that after doing it for an hour or so, she said, my shoulders felt like a lumberjack's. You guys remember what typewriters were like, right? It's not like today's keyboards. If we include the number of people who participated in those networks of samizdat, now we're talking probably about tens of thousands. And we know this because the KGB did a lot of my research for me, and they launched their own investigations of the distribution of various samizdat periodicals. And what their own research showed was that you could find producers and consumers of samizdat in every significant Soviet city, in dozens of cities across all the 11 time zones of the USSR. So this wasn't just, a bunch of intellectuals in Moscow and Leningrad and Kyiv. This was all across the Soviet Union and the various different republics. So that circle is in the tens of thousands. Some samizdat texts, by no means all, but a good proportion of them, made their way abroad, smuggled by foreign journalists or diplomats or tourists and others. And some of those samizdat texts made their way to the shortwave radio services that were broadcasting their shows to the Soviet population. And you've heard of many of these services. I'm sure you've heard of the BBC World Service. They had a Russian language program that reached people in the Soviet Union. Radio Liberty, which still exists today, although it's been expelled from Putin's Russia, broadcast 24/7 in the Russian language and in some of the non-Russian minority languages of the Soviet Empire. The Deutsche Welle, since we're in the Wende Museum, was West Germany's shortwave radio service, also targeting people on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And there were others. And many of the samizdat texts that made their way to the West were then broadcast back to the Soviet population. Now, it was in the nature of things that we don't have data on the number of listeners, right? This is not like people in this city do, where they know how many people watch this TV show and how many people bought tickets to this movie. We will never know exactly how many people were listening to those Russian language shortwave radio broadcasts. They used to call them the Voices, as in the Voice of America, one of the more popular ones. But on an anecdotal level, I think it's fair to say that millions of Soviet citizens were exposed to samizdat thanks to this boomerang effect of texts being smuggled abroad and then broadcast into the Soviet Union via these Western radio stations. And let's be clear about this. Many of these were CIA or MI6 subsidized programs. You know, there's a Cold War going on, and the intelligence services of the West are very keen to get dissident viewpoints to the Soviet population. That's what made it possible. So the chain reaction unfolds in this spontaneous, almost uncontrollable set of flashpoints, these trials and arrests and protests and transcripts, until the KGB starts to crack down. And that starts happening in 1968, where signing one of those letters can now get you fired from your job, can make sure that your son or daughter never gets into a university, can get you kicked out of your apartment, all kinds of extrajudicial punishments, in addition to or on the side of the actual arrests and judicial punishments of dissidents who were caught writing or distributing various texts. And when the crackdown begins on the 1,000 or so people who had the courage to put their names to these public petitions and letters, the dissident movement goes through a kind of crisis. Can it survive this crackdown? Can enough people remain to do this kind of work to keep the chain reaction going? And the answer is no. The movement begins to shrink. This is the sort of wordplay of the subtitle of my book, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. It has two meanings. The first meaning is, yes, we know the super famous names, the marquee names. We know the Nobel laureates, Andrei Sakharov, the great Soviet physicist, the person who invented the Soviet hydrogen bomb, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975, who became a household name in the 1970s, covers of every major magazine across the Western world. We know the name Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer, whose most famous work, the 3-volume indictment of the entire Soviet system called the Gulag Archipelago, which is partly an account of what life was like in the camps in the 1930s and 40s, but is also a philosophical statement, a sort of frontal assault on Marxism, Leninism, socialism. He wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, is forced out of the country, also becomes a household name across the Western world. But as I discovered in the course of doing my research for this book, those two guys were not the leaders of the dissident movement. Solzhenitsyn didn't want to be associated with the movement. He was a solo operator. He didn't want to be known as a dissident. He wrote a private letter from his exile in Vermont to Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s saying, "I am neither a dissident nor an emigre. I am a Russian writer." So he's not a team player. He doesn't want to be distracted by the inevitable politics of being part of a movement and agreeing on the texts of protest. He wrote what he wanted to write without any interference from anyone else. Andrei Sakharov was, in a way, part of the movement, but he came to it rather late. He came to it after 1968. So we can't use his story, his biography, to explain how the movement was born and how it became what it was. So by using the subtitle, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, I wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that a whole different cast of characters whose names have been forgotten, like Volpin, the intellectual godfather of the movement, the guy who came up with the just obey your own laws strategy, that these were the people whose lives I wanted to understand. And it was their stories that I wanted to tell. And I have to say one more thing about this. Much of what we knew at the time and know now about the dissident movement came to us through the Western journalists stationed in Moscow who were covering it in real time. These were the Evan Gershkovitzes of their day. Many of them did an outstanding job getting a version of the dissident story out to the world. And frankly, without that story, the dissidents would not have had a lifeline to Western publics, the United States, Western Europe, and elsewhere. But here's the catch, or one of the catches. Without exception, every one of those journalists, from Hedrick Smith on down, he was the New York Times correspondent in Moscow. Without exception, every one of them was a man. And without exception, the women who played such a central role in the dissident movement were simply invisible to them. They simply missed the way Soviet women had been central to the development and the sustenance of the movement. When it came time for them to sort of pluck people and put them in the spotlight and make them famous, which is what you can do if you're the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, it was as if they could only see the male dissidents. So part of the cast of characters who are missing from the story and who I've tried to bring up again to the surface to make them visible and to hear what they had to say, some of them I was able to interview before they died, are the women. Yuli Daniel was an important writer and translator, but after he was arrested in 1966 and sent to the camps, he no longer played any role in the movement. It was his wife, they divorced eventually, Larisa Bogoraz, who really put a stamp on the movement. Similarly, the person who founded the most important and longest-lived underground dissident periodical, the Chronicle of Current Events, which came out as close to monthly as possible, given the extraordinarily dangerous conditions under which it was produced, the mind behind that and the person who did more than anyone else to make that journal happen was the poet Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who is almost completely forgotten today. And when I say forgotten, I don't just mean, in LA or in the United States. I mean in Russia, these names have been forgotten. A few years ago, which is to say prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, there was pretty good data about public opinion. There was a center called the Levada Center in Moscow that did, really respectable public opinion polling research. And one of the many things that they discovered, polling the Russian population, the population of the Russian Federation, is that fewer than 1 in 5 Russians, regardless of age, regardless of where they lived, fewer than 1 in 5 Russians could name a single dissident by name. This is very upsetting to me, because this history, while it's fascinating to me and very moving to me, this is, or at least should be, the patrimony of today's Russians. This is their past. I would argue this is their usable past. This is a past that they really can build on. And yet it has atrophied and virtually disappeared from school curriculums and from public knowledge. Okay, so the chain reaction reaches its peak in 1968. The KGB begins to crack down. That crackdown has effects. Fewer and fewer people are willing to put their names on open letters or to engage in public protests, out on the streets or in the public squares, Red Square, Pushkin Square. And the movement has to reinvent itself to survive. The way it reinvents itself is to stop trying to be a social movement where gathering the maximum number of participants is the most important thing, and instead, as we would say, reformats itself as an NGO. Even though an NGO is kind of a logical contradiction within the Soviet world, because you can't really have non-governmental organizations in the Soviet system. The Communist Party exercises a monopoly over public political life. So they're trying to inhabit a space that doesn't exist in the Soviet world. And their great model for this, it turns out, is Amnesty International. With its headquarters in London, founded in 1961 by Peter Benenson, the son of Russian emigres. Those of you who are familiar with Amnesty International know that its brief is to come to the aid of what they call prisoners of conscience all over the world. What is a prisoner of conscience? A prisoner of conscience is someone who's done nothing other than express nonviolent opinions in his or her home country. And Amnesty, as an organization born at the peak of the Cold War, was very self-conscious about not being perceived as a Cold War or Western organization. And therefore they made all of their local chapters, and there was one here in LA, there was one in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland, Chicago, and in many other Western countries. Obviously the UK among them, but also Germany and the Netherlands had very important branches of Amnesty International. Every chapter was required to adopt, that's the language they used, adopt prisoners of conscience from, in equal proportion, from all of the three major, let's call them, political zones of the world. Okay, 10-second detour on political zones of the world. You're all familiar with the expression first world, as in that's really a first world problem. You all know the expression third world, as in the developing world. What you probably haven't bumped up against, unless you live in academia, is the second world. If there's a first and a third, there's got to be a second. And there was a second world, and that was the world of socialism. That was the Soviet world. The Soviet Union and its various allies. So Amnesty's rule was, you have to adopt prisoners of conscience in equal proportion from all three zones, so that you maintain political neutrality. It wasn't impossible to find political prisoners in all three zones. You might have to stretch the definition a bit, but there were certainly people in the United States in the 1960s and 70s who were in prison because of their political beliefs. Not to mention in socialist countries and in the developing world. What was really hard to do, though, practically impossible, was to achieve that proportionality when it came to membership in Amnesty International. And if you looked at a map of Amnesty's members, not the prisoners of conscience on whose behalf they worked, but the members themselves, it looked a lot like a map of NATO. United States, Canada, Great Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands. It was extremely lopsided towards the first world. And there's a really interesting story that I try to tell in the book about how the first chapter of Amnesty International was founded in Moscow. The first chapter in the second world, in the socialist world. And what a kind of nightmare this was for Amnesty International. Because to them, the idea that the prisoners of conscience who they were trying to adopt as their projects, the idea that those people would now be their collaborators and have a voice inside their organization itself, they simply weren't ready for it. And they were very suspicious that Soviet dissidents could act with the same kind of neutrality as the lawyers and doctors and academicians who made up most of Amnesty's members in the Western world felt that they could. It was kind of a moral dilemma for the organization. And I actually worked inside Amnesty's archive to see how that story played out. Some heads rolled, some people resigned, but in the end they did recognize the Moscow chapter. And Amnesty, as an expressly non-political, moral organization committed to human rights, became like a lodestar for this reformatted dissident movement. They could no longer marshal the numbers to actually keep the chain reaction growing. And so instead, they numerically shrank to, maybe 50, 100, 150 active members of the movement, and they reformatted themselves as an NGO. And what do NGOs do? Especially human rights NGOs. They disseminate information. They make violations of human rights known to the world. And they deploy the mechanism of naming and shaming. they expose the abuses to the viewpoint of the world public and seek to embarrass the states that commit those abuses. On one hand, you can see this as a variation of Alexander Volpin's strategy of getting the Soviet government to observe its own laws. The Soviet Union, after all, had signed many of the critical international human rights agreements. They did not sign the Universal Declaration of 1948, signed at the UN in San Francisco, but they had signed many other UN documents committing themselves to human rights norms. So in a way, this new version of the movement, a movement that had gone through a near death, that's the other meaning of the many lives, the movement that had to reinvent itself after almost being crushed. In a way, they were just scaling their strategy to a global level by exposing the Soviet Union's failure to honor international human rights accord rather than simply Soviet law domestically. But the naming and shaming mechanism requires that the alleged perpetrators of the violations actually feel ashamed. And if there's one thing we know from anthropology, it's that the feeling of being ashamed is culturally specific. It's not biologically grounded, it's not universal. And therefore you can't assume that what engenders shame in one situation, in one cultural setting, will automatically do it in another. So the naming and shaming ritual or practice or strategy was kind of an experiment of its own in the Soviet setting. I was very interested in the course of my research about how Soviet leaders reacted to these campaigns of exposure of violations. I was very fortunate, I should say, in the timing of this research because I did it during a period when, relative to before and after, Russian archives were wide open for research. And there are people in the audience today who know what I'm talking about from their own experience doing research in that part of the world. The window has more or less shut now, and of course it was very tightly closed before the collapse in 1991, but I did my research for this book in the early 2000s during a period when I could see a lot of things that can no longer be seen. One of the things that I was able to see were the transcripts of discussions held by the Politburo, which was the highest organ of the Communist Party, essentially the ruling organ composed of about a dozen members. And particularly during the Brezhnev era, late 60s, 70s, early 80s, we have quite a few of the Politburo transcripts. And I'm certainly not the first one to discover this, but it really struck me that Soviet leaders were extremely sensitive to criticism of human rights violations. I hadn't realized that. As a matter of fact, I think one of the most memorable moments for me happened when I was reading a transcript of a Politburo conversation, and Brezhnev, in his usual sort of doddering, grandfatherly way, is presiding over the discussion. And at one point, he begins, he's very indignant, you can tell that. He begins to describe to his comrades in the Politburo what my hometown newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, is saying about the Soviet Union. This is what Russians would call a provincial newspaper. This is not the New York Times or the Washington Post. This is the Baltimore Sun. Baltimore is where I grew up. And the leader of the Soviet Union is upset about what the Baltimore Sun has to say about his policies. This set off a kind of light bulb for me, that not only were Soviet leaders paying attention to criticism from the West as regards their treatment of dissidents, they were hypersensitive to it. And it turns out that they were hypersensitive because, as counterintuitive as this sounds, they thought the Soviet Union was the leading country in the world when it came to the protection of human rights. There's a lot more to be said, but I do want to leave time for Q&A. And the story ends on a grim note. It can't be denied. The dissident strategy of forcing the Soviet Union to obey its own laws did not work. If anything, it pushed the Soviet government, I don't blame the dissidents for this, I blame the government, but it pushed the Soviet government to bypass its own legal system and to rely less and less on trials, which always made bad publicity and kept the chain reaction going, and more on non-legal forms of punishment, firing people from their jobs, punishing family members, and most insidiously putting people in psychiatric institutions so that they would never go on trial and never have an opportunity to speak their piece and their case. So if anything, it moved the Soviet government to be less law-abiding than it already was. And when the NGO model of dissident self-organization reached its pinnacle in the late 1970s with the foundation of the so-called Helsinki Watch Groups, groups designed to ensure that the Soviet Union lived up to the most recent international human rights accords signed in Helsinki in 1975, the KGB decided enough is enough. We don't want this kind of information making its way to the West. We don't want the embarrassment and the shame of this exposure. And that's when they decided to crack down on even the tiny remnants of what had been a social movement. Even the NGO version of the movement became too much. And essentially by 1982, the movement had been crushed. Another question I often get from people is, did the dissidents help bring down the Soviet Union? In a way they did. I don't think it was the major factor. I think the thing that brought down the Soviet Union was Gorbachev's attempt to fix it. That's what broke it. But what the dissidents did do was to expose to everybody, Soviet citizens as well as observers outside the Soviet Union, that this was a country that was incapable of observing its own laws. This was a government that could produce a constitution but couldn't live up to it. And that in some ways was the most shameful thing of all. Because if there's one thing that we associate with being modern and running a modern society, it's the rule of law. And the Soviet Union, in many respects, was incapable of operating by the rule of law. And that did a lot to hollow out the moral credibility of Soviet socialism and expose it for what it was and for the arbitrariness that it practiced towards its own citizens. And so in that limited but I think potent version, the dissidents did contribute to the death of the system. In closing, I just want to say, as a kind of perhaps final point of irony, they never intended to destroy the system. And most people, dissident or not, in the Soviet Union couldn't imagine the system ever ending. It seemed simply to be forever. So it's not that the dissidents set out to topple the Soviet government, but by exposing its inability to rule according to its own laws, they contributed to its undermining. That, I think, is an important part of their legacy, but another important part is the hope that they kept up in spite of what seemed like a hopeless situation. Hence the title of my book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause. Not my words, that's the most famous toast that dissidents would make around kitchen tables in their apartments from Moscow to Kamchatka. That sense of irony was sort of hard-baked into them. They recognized that in a sense what they were doing was absolutely hopeless, and yet they persevered with that characteristic Russian combination of boldness and despair. And if you think about what appears to us to be a hopeless situation in our own country, creeping authoritarianism, an inability to really cope with climate change and other versions of environmental degradation, the seeming absence of mechanisms that can combat the moral quandary of increasing inequality, of staggering inequality. If Soviet dissidents could persevere under conditions infinitely more challenging, and in some sense hopelessly impossible than our own, then surely we can too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I can imagine you are a beloved professor at University of Pennsylvania because you are a remarkable storyteller, and I just was, I know that I was riveted, so I just thank you so much for your ability to break down these complex narratives and stories, give them the individual feel, but also just give us an incredible overview of this history. Before I open it up to questions, we are an institution who holds Samizdat materials. And you are here because a researcher, Ann Komoromi, came and looked at some of the materials we have on hand. and she invited you. And we are on the precipice of getting ready to open up an exhibition called Undercurrents, which will bring to life the distribution mechanisms of which Sasha Smuckler, Soviet Jewish dissident, was involved in. And I guess my question is, like, not everyone has access to these materials. We're about to give more access to the public through this exhibition. And in your access, was there a particular primary source material, a document that completely changed your course of research? You were on one tangent or direction, and a primary source material just kind of upset all of that, and even the way you were thinking about things, and changed the course of your research.
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's very exciting to hold Samizdat in your hands because you don't know who else might have held it. Was it the author? Was it someone just one degree of separation from the author who received the original manuscript and typed 8 or 10 copies to distribute? Imagine being a part of the edgiest book club in the world, where all you ever read is forbidden literature. How exciting would that be? Primary sources. So one of the remarkable things about the dissident movement is the proportion of participants who have produced memoirs. I have kept a running count, and at least according to what I've been able to learn, there are over 150 book-length autobiographies by dissidents. So if we go back to that innermost concentric circle that I described, the people who are actually putting their names to open letters, not just the distributors and readers of Samizdat or the listeners over the shortwave broadcast, but the people actually at the epicenter of the movement. If it's 150 out of 1,000, that's 15% of the movement producing memoirs. I honestly don't think there has ever been another social movement in history where such a high proportion of participants produce their own life stories in the form of a published book. So for an historian, needless to say, that's a gold mine. You've got all these amazing life stories just unfolding right in front of you. But it's also a treacherous, slippery slope. Because if all you work with are autobiographies, you end up getting sucked into this echo chamber because all of these people knew each other. One of the things that's so magnetic about Russia is the intensity of adult friendships there. It's something that will stay with me forever from my time living there. And that was equally true, maybe even more true within the dissident movement. These were relationships based on deep levels of trust. Lots of people were sleeping with each other too, but that's another story. But if all you have is that corpus of memoirs, it becomes a kind of echo chamber. And every historian, no matter what you're working on, at some point, obviously you want to know what your actors think and feel and how they see the world. But you cannot be hostage to their worldview. You have to find some way of stepping outside it and looking at it from your own perspective. If you don't do that, you're just reproducing what they saw and what they knew. That's important, but that's not the whole job. You also need to gain your own perspective. So I needed a place to stand outside that magic circle of memoirs. And that place turned out to be interrogation transcripts by the KGB. I mentioned, as part of the chain reaction, all of those hundreds of open letters that people signed at risk of getting arrested or damaging their careers or their kids' job and life prospects. Not one of those open letters was ever responded to by the government. They were archived, and you will find them in the archives of the Soviet state, various branches, but they never responded. They didn't think it worthy of them to respond to these troublemakers, who they all thought were just stooges of the CIA and the other Western intelligence services. The one time in the life of a dissident when you actually got to have a dialogue with a representative of the state was when you were being interrogated by a KGB agent. That was the living embodiment of the Soviet government right there. The guy with the epaulets, it was always a male, epaulets on his shoulder, who had sat down with you in an interrogation room and started grilling you. These interrogations could last anywhere from an hour to 8 hours, and you could be subject to them for a couple of days or for months on end. I would have loved to have gained access to the KGB archive in Moscow, but I couldn't. But there were 2 back doors. In Russia, there's always a back door. They call it the black door, the черный вход. There's always a back door in Russia. The first back door was, a law was passed in the 1990s under Yeltsin that said anybody who wanted to request their dossier from the secret police files had the right to do so. Or if they were no longer living, their descendants could do so. And a number of former dissidents took advantage of that law to get more or less complete copies of their dossiers. Some of those were copied again and made their way to the West. For example, Andrei Sinyavsky, the writer who was arrested in the fall of 1965, his KGB dossier is now at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Gold mine. It includes weeks and weeks of interrogation transcripts where you can basically be a fly in the room listening to Sinyavsky talk with his KGB interrogator back and forth. Obviously, those conversations are extremely fraught. The power imbalance is immense. You can't assume that either side is telling the truth, but they allowed me to step outside the memoirs and see dissidents in real time interacting with their nemesis, the Soviet state. That's the first back door. The second back door is that when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, what had been one country became 15. So there wasn't just Russia, there was now Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all of the stans. Well, each of the non-Russian republics had its own branch office of the KGB. And in contrast to the Russian KGB, which is the mother lode, over which I still salivate, but will in my lifetime almost certainly never get in, unlike the Russian KGB office, the non-Russian republics were only too happy to have researchers come in and expose to the world all the terrible things that the Russians did to, name your non-Russian nationality, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians. I worked quite a bit at the Lithuanian KGB archive in the city of Vilnius. And one of the things that I discovered there was a 30-volume collection of interrogation transcripts that came from the Moscow branch. The different branches communicated with each other. So that was my back door to Moscow, was through Lithuania. Other people here, including Jared McBride, professor at UCLA, have worked with the Ukrainian branch of the KGB materials. So under current circumstances, as an historian, you have to be resourceful. But that was my back door into the KGB, which in turn was my more or less independent, or at least different place to stand outside all those juicy memoirs. I'd be happy to take other questions from anybody who might have one.
Thank you. You can hear me all right?
Yes.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
My question is about during the period of dissidence and the resistance, what was the general opinion of Russian people? I mean, I remember reading Life magazine 1956 that the majority of Russians thought the communist system was great. They couldn't imagine anything else. And secondly, the dissidents, in as much as they were trying to affirm their rights, were they still true believers in Marxism as a system that could be, or that was preferable, say, to the system of the West?
Thank you. Great questions. I mentioned some of the polling data from the earlier Putin era about what today's recent Russian citizens know and don't know about the dissident movement. We have nothing analogous for the Soviet period. So anybody who says anything about what the Soviet population thought of topic X is really treading on thin ice. But I myself was very interested in this question, and I have a chapter called Participants, Allies, and Bystanders. And your question is, how many allies were there? How many people who were sympathetic to the dissident cause but didn't want to risk their neck participating in the movement, or maybe thought they would just do better by helping the families of imprisoned dissidents, some kind of indirect participation. So there were significant numbers of allies. Some of them got together to create a kind of social welfare fund for the families of arrested dissidents, because you still had to feed the kids and put clothes on their backs. But one of the most depressing things that I learned in the course of doing my research was how few Soviet citizens were really allies of the dissident movement, and how many of them took in and, as far as one can tell, believed the official propaganda that these people were in some way, shape, or form outsiders, assisted by Westerners with a suspiciously close relationship to Western journalists. Why was so much of their message being broadcast by radio stations owned by Western countries? So they did not have a lot of allies in Soviet society. And the regime knew this and took advantage of it to further stigmatize them and isolate them. So that's the first question. Sorry, the second question, I'm already blanking.
Oh, about the second question concerns the dissidents themselves. Were they actually...
Were they Marxist-Leninist believers? Yeah. Okay, so dissidents had many different paths to joining the movement. Very few of them would I call born dissidents. Many of them started out as believers. Sinyavsky himself worked as an informer for the KGB. And in fact, that is the role that produced the moral crisis for him that led him to dissent. He was asked to inform on an exchange student from Paris, a woman whose father happened to be the naval attaché at the French embassy. KGB, couldn't keep their hands off of her because they thought they could blackmail her. And Sinyavsky eventually refused to cooperate that, even though initially he was working as an informant. The most interesting thing I can say to you about that question is that no, dissidents were not, with just a handful of exceptions, were not believers in the promise of communism. But what's really interesting about them is that they didn't think economics mattered very much. They were not against socialism. They took the socialist system like the air they breathed and the water they drank. It seemed entirely natural to them that you would have a system whose goal was social justice and a relatively egalitarian distribution of wealth. I say relatively as in compared to the West. They were not critics of the planned economy. And what made them really lousy Marxists is that they didn't think there was any intrinsic connection between the material life of the economic world and, say, intellectual life, ideology, law, what Marx calls the superstructure, everything like politics and culture. They didn't see any connection between the two. That means they were really bad Marxists, because that's in some ways the most fundamental thing about Marxism, is that our material lives shapes our consciousness. That's the foundational idea. They didn't believe that. They thought they could reform the Soviet system just by making the government observe its own laws, not by dismantling socialism. That's a point that was lost on many Western reporters, who assumed that they were, as Americans so often do, that they were little versions of us, that had just been born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain through an irony of fate, that they were little surrogate soldiers in the Cold War battle of Western liberal democracy against Soviet totalitarianism. That's a serious misconstrual of who they were and what they were about. Other questions? I see a hand in the back.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I was just wondering, I don't know if these people are in your book or not, but do you have anything to say about, I don't know if they're exactly dissidents, but I know they were treated badly. People like Andrei Tarkovsky or Sergei Parajanov, or later on Alexander Sokurov, the filmmakers, who were kind of like slowed down or put away like Parajanov, or silenced for a while like Sokurov.
Yeah. The people that you mentioned could stand for a much larger group of writers, artists, painters, who were sympathetic, I would say, to the dissident plight, because they too wanted freedom of expression. But almost without exception, were really dubious about the strategy of the rule of law. They tended to have a much more Soviet view of law, which is that law really doesn't matter. It's just a facade behind which the real levers of power operate. And Twardowski and other, I mean, he's the most famous for sure, but many artists of that caliber were more interested in what they called inner freedom. So not necessarily just freedom from state interference, but a kind of spiritual freedom that was able to liberate itself from consumerism, from the Cold War dichotomy that seemed to want to, suck everything into its vortex. And inner freedom doesn't require necessarily the state to honor its own laws. So I would say they stand for a group of people who were sympathetic to the dissidents but didn't want to be identified as such, and certainly were not signing the petitions, the open letters, because they needed to preserve whatever elbow room they had to make their art, and they didn't want to jeopardize that by going public with any kind of opposition.
Thanks, Ben. So your first official book talk. So I'm just going to ask a question that I'm sure you'll probably get at every book talk for the coming year, and it's something very much in the news, and it's specifically as of last week with the return or appearance or of these Russian dissidents in the United States, and this is around this question of Russian colonialism or Russian imperialism. And I know you have many actors in your book. What's your assessment of how that question is dealt with in the Soviet dissident movement on a whole? Whether you see that as a shortcoming or what those shortcomings are, and then perhaps any extrapolations on that to the present and the moment that we're in. And then maybe a more personal question. As someone, you mentioned the Historical Guild as a seasoned member of the Guild. Any reflections from this project about what you, or changes in what you thought about the Soviet state and how it functioned and how it worked? Anything that kind of gave you pause or made you reevaluate your own thoughts about this, which you may have held for decades? So.
Thank you. Yeah. So the first question is about sort of, are there traces of Russocentrism, or maybe even stronger Russian sort of imperialism, even within the dissident milieu? The first thing to say is that question, that issue, that very sensitive issue, was alive and kicking in real time during the movement. Just for lack of time, I couldn't go into all of the elements that contributed to the chain reaction. I selected the most prominent and consequential of them, which was the arrest of Sinyavsky and Daniel and the transparency meeting and the trial. But the fact is, more or less parallel phenomenon were going on in Ukraine at roughly the same time. But Western journalists were never posted in Ukraine. They were almost always restricted to Moscow, maybe a side trip to Leningrad every once in a while. And here again, you see how incredibly significant the Western gaze was for who got noticed, what got noticed, and just as important, who didn't get noticed, who was left in the shadows of this story because Western journalists didn't put them on the marquee, didn't make them globally famous. The two non-Russian currents within the movement that we know the most about are the Lithuanian and the Ukrainian. Lithuania is a tiny country, then as now, but it exercised an outside influence because of its Catholicism, and because just like in Poland under Solidarity, the Catholic Church was an abiding institutional presence in Lithuania. And that became, I was talking about how do I get out of that magic circle of Soviet memoirs and achieve my own independent perspective. Lithuanian dissidents, many of them, had the Catholic Church as a place to stand ideologically and morally speaking that allowed them to step outside the magic circle of Soviet propaganda and ideology. Ukraine had a different set of motives, one of which was, of course, cultural independence from Moscow. You probably are aware, given all of the headlines over the last few years, that Ukrainians and Russians are in many ways very similar. The Russians claim there's actually no distinction, that they are brothers and sisters. Their languages are extremely close. If you know one, you can kind of make your way through the other. Roughly like, say, Spanish and Italian. The unintended consequence of that linguistic and cultural proximity is that when assimilation happens in the Soviet Union, what the Ukrainians face is the disappearance of their language because it's already so close to Russian. Lithuanian is a totally different language, and while there were pressures on Lithuania as a cultural space, Ukraine really faced the threat of extinction in the Soviet system, of gradual assimilation into a Russocentric world. And so dissidents in Ukraine were much more likely to be interested in national autonomy, or in some cases full-blown independence. And that made them very sensitive to any symptoms of Russocentrism or Russian imperial thinking emanating from Moscow, which is where the most famous dissidents lived. Again, in part because Western journalists were stationed in Moscow, and that's who they met, and that's whose pictures ended up on the front pages of the LA Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and other newspapers. Your other question is about sort of what I've been surprised by. I love being surprised. I mean, that's why I go to archives. I don't travel halfway across the world and spend 8 hours a day in a dusty room in order to have everything I thought confirmed. That would be kind of a waste of time and money. So I really do like to be surprised. What was I surprised by? Well, I mentioned Brezhnev's quoting the Baltimore Sun. But the other thing was, in these many, many interrogation transcripts that I read, I was shocked at the indifference of the KGB interrogators in the inner lives of their victims. They just wanted them to spill names. They were just trying to incriminate as many people. Who did you know? Who did you get that samizdat text from? Who told you that? Who did you give it to? If you look at interrogation transcripts from the 1930s, from the high water mark, or I guess you could say the low mark, of Stalinism, those interrogators wanted to bare the souls of their victims. They wanted to know who their parents were, what were their class origins, what was the nature of their consciousness. They wanted to drill down. It was really like a confession to a priest. That's what interrogations felt like in the 1930s. By the time you get to the 1960s, where mass violence has been essentially removed, or at least random violence has essentially been deleted from the menu of governing techniques, they really don't care about the dissidents' belief. They just want to finger them. Did you get money from somebody at the American embassy? Did you talk to an American journalist? Who do you know? It's just all about extracting, incriminating kind of forensic data. And that, to me, was a symptom of ideological apathy in the KGB itself. The epicenter of the Soviet system. The crucible that gave us Vladimir Putin. They really didn't care about ideas by that point. That has to be one of the things that made the collapse of the system possible. Because the ideological glue just wasn't there anymore. People were paying lip service to that ideology. In my book, I call the Soviet Union a lip service state. That's the kind of service to the state that most people are rendering, is they're just mouthing the words that you need to say in public. But when you look at these interrogations, you realize that the people at the heart of the system, they just didn't care about ideas. They just wanted to arrest as many people as possible so they could make their way up the career ladder. That really is the sense that I came away with, and that surprised me.
Yeah, hello, it was a very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
And I want to ask you, how the ideology of dissident movement influenced the perestroika in Russia? So as I understand, when the events in Russia, political events, came out, so the ideology of dissidents just swept away. It disappeared. And other people came on the, came on the way, yeah? So, yeah, that's my question. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, if we begin at the level of keywords, terminology, it wasn't Gorbachev who came up with glasnost. It was Alexander Volpin. I mean, the word existed in the Russian vocabulary going back centuries, but it was Volpin who made glasnost a political term in a specific way. Another of the keywords of the perestroika era under Gorbachev was demokratizatsiya, democratization. The dissident movement was often known as the democratic movement. That was just as common a term in its own time. I think it's fair to say that some of the dissident lexicon, but also ways of thinking, entered into Gorbachev's way of thinking. And as I said, Gorbachev and his reform program, more than any other single factor, I believe, explains the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unintended collapse of the Soviet Union, because Gorbachev never intended that as the outcome, never. Gorbachev himself wrote memoirs, as you might expect, and what he says there is that, I can't remember the exact words, but that the moral impact of the dissident movement was far greater than the number of people involved. And believe it or not, until recently, that's what the mandatory textbook for Russian high school students also said about the dissident movement, that its impact on the cultural and moral environment in the Soviet Union was far out of proportion with the number of people who were actually active in the movement. The most recent textbook, created after the invasion of Ukraine, goes back to a very Soviet way of looking at the movement, namely, these people were all puppets of Western intelligence services, and they got what they deserved. So I think there was a subtle impact of dissident ideas on Gorbachev's thinking. He also writes in his memoirs of some of the samizdat texts that he and his wife, Raisa, who was actually much better read than Gorbachev was, she was more of an intellectual, they read some samizdat texts themselves that they had gotten from diplomats who had bought them in Europe and then smuggled them back into the Soviet Union. But we also have to be, as much as I would love to claim credit for the dissidents, we have to be honest about this. For Gorbachev, the economy was the single most important area of reform. He was a believing Marxist-Leninist. He did want to return the Soviet Union to its original Marxist-Leninist promise. And the way he thought he could do that was by reforming the economy. So unlike the dissidents, for him, economic issues were front and center. So we can't just see him as a kind of belated revival of dissident ideas now emanating from the Kremlin itself. The story is more complicated than that. The final thought that I would just try out on you, given your question, is the following. And this is something that a remarkable range of people in Russia agreed on then and agree on now. Gorbachev believed it, Putin believes it, and many ordinary Russians believed it. And that is that serious, consequential reform in that system can only come from the top down. Or in the case of the Soviet period, from inside the party. And Gorbachev says in his memoirs, as much as I may have found certain ideas of people like Andrei Sakharov appealing and impressive, there could be no effective reform if it originated outside the party. You can make of that what you will, but to my mind, that has become a self-defeating prophecy in Russian history, because it excludes the idea that normal citizens could actually be engaged in the process of debating and deciding the common good, and insists that only the political elite can ever articulate and carry out reforms. And if there's one thing we know, it's that political elites don't like to reform themselves. And that is why the Russian state is shockingly archaic today, in today's modern world. It is top-heavy, it exercises a form of power that is highly person-centric, and it is not subject to the rule of law, including its own laws. And that, my friends, is a very dangerous situation. Thank you.
All right.
You want to ask it?
Sure.
Okay, here.
I don't think this will take too long. I was just curious. I have more of an observation. You mentioned Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago, which must have depended on Samizdat. I find it curious that he tried to distance himself so much from dissidents, I guess, or even the creators, I want to say network, but that sounds like too.
No, that's the right word.
Okay.
Network. Yeah. Let me try to clarify what I said. He never disowned the movement, or certainly not the mechanism of samizdat, but he never wanted to be a group player or a group member. He didn't want to sign anything or join any of the various NGOs that the dissidents started inventing. The history of the text of the Gulag Archipelago is quite interesting. It did not circulate by samizdat. It circulated by something related to samizdat called tamizdat, which means published over there. At some point, I won't go into the details, but at some point, Gorbachev gave the signal that a copy of the Gulag Archipelago, which he had authorized, could be smuggled to Paris and published there by a Russian emigre publishing house. And when I say published, I mean like a book, like three volumes of a bound book. Samizdat is just a sheath of onion paper with, it's got sweat and oil from people's hands on it. The edges are frayed. The Gulag Archipelago was printed in Paris in Russian, an authorized version, and then smuggled back into the Soviet Union. It was also broadcast as what we would now call an audiobook by the shortwave radio stations, starting in 1974, the year he was expelled from the country. So it did not really circulate widely in the Soviet Union by samizdat, but by these other sort of secondary mechanisms that fed off of samizdat. And of course, it changed many people's understanding of the 20th century forever.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll maybe leave the rest of the questions to the reception time, which will start now. And thank you so much, Ben. This has been so fascinating.
Thank you. Thank all of you for coming.
We have some books on the table next to Maggie. So if you'd like to have your book signed, we'll make sure that Ben has a good smudge-proof pen with him. And then if this subject was of interest to you, as I mentioned, we have our Undercurrents 2 exhibition that's officially opening on October 13th. It'll be in the hallway on this side of the museum, and we'll feature a lot of our samizdat materials, much of that onion skin paper with all of the fingerprints on it that Ben talked about. So we welcome you back then, if not before. And yes, please pick up a book, get a signature, and have some wine. Thank you all.
Thanks again.